afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the LTC webinar series. My name is Brian Bates. I'm Director of Professional Learning for the LTC. And just a couple things before we get started today. First, we're recording today's webinar, and it'll be available on our website later on this afternoon at the conclusion of the webinar. You can find it at ltcillinois.org/events/webinars. Scroll to the bottom of the page and you will find the archived webinars from not only today, but also from the 2020-2021 school year. You can also check out the upcoming webinars that we have in the next few months as we kind of close out the 2020-2021 school year. Also, if you want to ask any questions during today's webinar, please feel free to use the chat feature. Just make sure you select to send the chat to everyone, send the questions to everyone so we can all see what's going on. And then lastly, those of you attending live today in person, you will receive the evaluation for PD hours tomorrow in your email. So be on the lookout for that tomorrow morning. So without further ado, this is where I normally turn it over to today's speaker, but I'm going to go ahead and take the reins today. Again, thank you all for joining us. Today's topic is SOPPA for Teachers, how to be a partner in protecting student data. If you just joined, again, my name is Brian Bates. I'm Director of Professional Learning for the LTC. My email is on the screen, my Twitter handle, as well as our website and our Twitter handle for the LTC. If you're not familiar with the LTC, we are a State Board of Education program that supports K-12 school districts in Illinois with pretty much everything technology, from funding and procurement to network infrastructure, cybersecurity, data privacy, professional learning for using that technology in the classrooms, administrator academies, coaching, as well as online courses, remote learning, parental support, you name it. If it has to do with technology and education, we pretty much do it. So feel free to reach out to me or to the organization if you have any other questions or if there's anything you're looking for in particular. My background, I spent 10 years in middle school at either math or science teacher. Spent a little time as an assistant principal before joining the PD world. I was a PD coordinator for a couple regional offices in Western Illinois, in Macomb and Galesburg, ROE 26 and 33, before joining the LTC about 3 years ago. And I love what we're able to do, and I love what I do here. So please feel free to reach out. Before we get started, there's one thing that I do want to mention, and that is when it comes to SOPPA, and we'll get into what that means here shortly. Before we get started, I want to make sure that I kind of say that we're going to speak in generalizations today. I like to think of SOPPA compliance a lot like teaching standards. Teaching standards tell us what we're supposed to teach, but it doesn't necessarily say how we have to teach it or how we get there. SOPPA compliance is the same way. It says what we have to do to be compliant, but it doesn't say how that district has to be, what the district has to do in order to get to that compliance. So your districts may be in a variety of stages of developing the compliance program and policies. So if we talk about something today that you haven't heard of, that's fine. It's probably coming down the pipe. If you're further along than some of the stuff we talk about, that's great too. Each district is handling it a little bit differently. So we'll speak more in generalizations than specifics. So I just wanted to make sure I got that out there so we knew about that before we start. So if you have any questions at all when it comes to SOPPA compliance and how that impacts you directly in your district, highly recommend you talk to your building administrator or your technology point of contact, somebody there at your district to get more specific answers that we might not be able to give you today. So with that said, what is SOPPA? I've been using this term a little bit now. I'll pop open the chat also so I can see. Thanks, Chris, for posting the slide deck. It is also down in the bottom right-hand corner on each of the slides. I appreciate that. Chris is also hanging out in the background to help out a little bit here with facilitation. Chris is the director of Technology Services at the LTC, and a lot of the content from today came from resources that he has been a big part of creating for the LTC. So a huge shout out to Chris for helping me kind of put this all together as well. So I'll make sure I don't want to move on before I mention that. So what is SOPPA? Well, this comes from the actual legislation itself, as well as from our legal brief that I have linked at the end of the slide deck. SOPPA says that effective July 1, 2021, school districts will be required by the Student Online Personal Protection Act, that's where that acronym comes from, to provide additional guarantees that student data is protected when collected by educational technology companies and that the data is used for beneficial purposes only. So what does that all mean in easier to understand terms? First off, have to be compliant by July 1st, 2021. So currently, districts are working on developing the plans and policies for what they're going to do to become compliant on that date. It includes all service providers who collect student data. Doesn't matter if it's a free resource or a paid resource. If they are collecting data, you have to have you have to include those service providers in your compliance. How do you make sure you're compliant? Well, it's achieved through a signed agreement with the vendor and provider. So districts will have signed agreements with the ed tech provider that spells out how the compliance is going to work. Some other things that are covered in the SOPPA legislation is the process for parents to exercise their rights to their students' data, and as well as notification of data breaches, what districts are required to do to notify that it's that it is has had a data breach. I'm just checking in the slide deck here. Slideshow is not advancing. Can't say I've ever had that happen before, but hey, here we go. Awesome. Well, nothing too terrible, crazy that you can't go back and take a look at on your own. So we'll just keep going ahead. Awesome. Well, thank you for pointing that out, and thank you to everyone for the feedback. Feel good now that we got it working. So we'll move on. I just mentioned on that last slide that any provider or vendor that is collecting student data must have an agreement with the district. And we'll talk about what that agreement includes in a little bit. But as far as student data, what it means to be collecting student data, SOPPA is dealing with personally identifiable information, or PII. You may have heard about information being collected and personally identifiable information in other legislation such as FERPA. And so this kind of builds on that a little bit, but almost goes into the technology side of it, not just basic school records. Some examples of PII include first and last name, email address, home address and phone number, grades, socioeconomic information, test results, photos, medical records. Anything that can be used to go back and directly identify the student is considered to be personally identifiable information. So if they're collecting this information, then they have to be in an agreement with the district. So what's it mean to be in an agreement, and what does that agreement look like? A vendor or provider is SOPPA compliant if they're not using data for targeted ads. I know that whenever I search for something on Google and then I turn around within 5 minutes of opening up Instagram, I have an ad pop up that is exactly what I was just searching for. They're not allowed to collect data and then turn around and use ads that are targeted to the students based on that data. They're not allowed to profile students unless it is to advance the school purposes. So, it's okay to collect data that allows you to kind of build a profile of what the student's skill level is, and then apply that to maybe the pathway for learning. But if they're collecting data to profile the students in any way that's not a school-related purpose, they're not allowed to do that. Not allowed to do anything with the information as far as selling or renting it out. They cannot disclose information unless required by law or as part of maintenance and development. They have to be using reasonable security practices. That's a very general term of what reasonable is. But for the most part, they have to be doing the minimum requirements of what most companies would do to protect that data. So if they're storing the data on a server, that server has to be protected. If the data needs to be protected as it moves back and forth between the student and the app or the resource. So they just have to make sure that they are maintaining reasonable security practices to keep the data safe, whether it's being transported, whether it's being stored, however it's being used. They have to delete student data when requested. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but if there's a request to delete the student data, they must delete the data. They also have to publicly disclose the information about how the data is being used, their terms of service, the agreement that they have, as well as their privacy policy. So there's a lot of requirements there of the vendors or the apps or websites in order to be able to enter this SOPPA compliant agreement. Now, for this part, this isn't necessarily essential as a classroom teacher or a coach, but as I mentioned in the last slide, there's these apps and resources that all have privacy policies, and you can review those. Generally, if you go to their website, if it's an app, most of the time it's housed on the website. But if you go to the website for whatever tool it is that you use, you can scroll on down to the bottom and you can find in the small print usually a link to privacy policies. Now, sometimes in the case of the couple examples I listed here, you have to go through multiple clicks before you get to the right stuff. But just to show you kind of what privacy policies say and how they are explaining what they're doing with the data, we'll take a look at an example here. Edpuzzle was a favorite of mine when I was in the classroom still. Could you let me know in the chat if you see, since I've had some screen sharing issues, if you've seen the Edpuzzle website pop up? Okay, excellent. It's nice to see some things work every now and then. So there's some overview here from Edpuzzle, and then it goes down and there's a lot of legal conversations, a lot of different stuff that they have there. But if you scroll all the way down here a little ways, you'll find where it talks about what information does Edpuzzle collect from children and how is it used. And it goes through and it mentions that that we ask students to provide a unique username, email, password, their first, last name, unique code that's given to them by their teacher to join the class. Beyond that, they can submit responses, comments, audio, images, depending on the activities they are assigned, which remain private between the teacher and student. So it talks about what the basic information is that they're collecting. There's some other stuff that they collect as well that it mentions there. It talks about as far as who's able to see this information. It's not available to the public or other students. Teachers can share classes and grades and scores, and so therefore other teachers can see the data. But again, we're hoping that the teachers are using that data appropriately as well. So it talks about who can see it. If you continue scrolling down, it goes a little bit more about the information it's collecting, and then how does it use the information it collects? It talks here about how it uses the information, providing, improving the service, responding to requests, customizing the service, protecting the community by making sure the service remains safe and secure, all that kind of stuff. How long does it keep it? So there's a lot of different things that you can find in the privacy policy for each of the tools or apps that you may use that kind of help clarify what they're doing with the student data, how they store it, why they're collecting it, and some of the different things that you can do. If you want to delete the data, it does talk about how long it takes. It'll delete it after a certain amount of time, but you can request to delete it. So there's a lot of different things that you can look at there. Now, again, that's something that you don't necessarily have to do as a teacher, but if you're interested in that kind of stuff, it's really interesting to go down and check that out. So I highly recommend just keeping an eye on it and just seeing exactly what they're using data for your students. Now, so far, all the onus has been on the vendor or the provider to be compliant and have all these different policies in place to protect the student data. But it also is on the school district as well. That's why there's an agreement. They both say that they're going to protect the data. So as far as the district requirements go, districts have to have this written agreement with all providers, free and paid, who collect student data. It doesn't matter if it's a resource that every single student uses every single day, something that is like Google Docs or maybe Seesaw if you use that in the elementary schools, or something that you use for one lesson, one day of the year. If you use it, you have to have an agreement with the providers if it's collecting that student data. The district itself has to also implement and maintain reasonable security practices. So that, again, that's the simple stuff of securing the data as it's being transported to the resource. That's requiring password changes, all sorts of different things that make a school network secure. And then the district is also required to notify parents of a breach within 30 days. So if there's a data breach at one of those resources, they have to notify the parents within 30 days. So that way they know that the data may have been compromised. They also have to be very transparent about what is being done with the students' data at the district. So somewhere on the district website, the district must post the following: a list of all the services or applications that are being utilized by the district, all the data elements that the school is collecting, maintaining, or disclosing, contracts for each operator within 10 days of signing. So once that agreement is signed, it's got to be posted up there within 10 days so that it's up there for people to review. Subcontractors for each operator. So if any of the main contract or main providers have subcontracted, you got to have that information as well. Process for how parents can exercise their rights to inspect, review, and correct information maintained by the school operator or ISB. So if they are collecting student data, parents have the right to inspect, review, or correct information. So there has to be a list of how it's the process for parents to be able to do that. They also must post data breaches within 10 days. So notifying a data breach within 10 days. So there is a little bit of a requirement there for districts. This is a sample of what it might look like on a district. Again, all districts are going to handle this differently. So this is just a generalized approach to it. It's got the logo on the left-hand side. It has the purpose for the resource. You can see in the one column where it lists they're all approved. If this is a screenshot, so you can't click on the agreement, but that blue agreement, it would open up the agreement to look at. It says when it was approved and when it expires, the grade levels it's being used, and the content areas if they apply. So that's just one way that a district might display the resources that are being used within the district. So up until now, we've talked about how this affects a vendor. We've also talked about how this affects the district. But this is all coming back to the classroom teacher. And how does it affect someone that's in the classroom? How does it affect an instructional coach or somebody who is, boots on the ground using these resources on a daily basis? The best part about this is it really won't have much of an impact on educators in the classroom working with these tools on a daily basis. There's really just a few ways that you'll see the impact of SOPPA at the classroom level or at that level. First, you may have already at this point, or you may in the future be asked by your district to provide a list of tools, apps, websites, and resources that you use in your classroom. So they may ask you to submit the different resources that you currently use. And again, like I mentioned before, it doesn't matter if it's free or paid. It doesn't matter if you use it one day or every day. If it's being used and it's collecting student information, you need to make sure that you list it. So you may be asked to do that. Again, not all districts are going to do it the exact same way. So if you're not asked, it's not a big deal, but that's just one way that you might be impacted. The other way that might be an impact is, we all go to workshops or conferences and we learn about really new cool tools and we really want to go and we want to try them out. After July 1, as you find these new tools and these new resources at these conferences, or you stumble across them, checking out Twitter or searching the internet, you may be asked to submit them to your district to be vetted before you're able to use them. Again, districts have different methods for doing this. I've seen something as simple as a Google form where you put in a little bit of information and submit it, and then they'll go through and they'll vet it, and they may have an agreement in place already. They might not. They might be able to go in and get that agreement. They might not. It all depends. But before you just start using a new tool or resource, chances are there's going to be some method of submitting that to your district or your building administrator or your technology point of contact, and they will be able to help you out as far as making sure that it is approved and there is an agreement in place. Now, this is probably less likely than the other two things happening, but there may be a situation where you might have to find an alternative. Most ed tech companies are probably going to want to continue their relationship with districts, especially if they're a paid service. So it's very, very incentivized for them to comply. However, if it's a resource that maybe isn't 100% educational as far as their target audience, like maybe a video editing software or an audio editing software, something where it's not just specific to education, they might not be as inclined to make sure that they comply with all these things. If for some reason for whatever reason, whether it's they're not SOPA compliant, agreement can't be reached, or a district says, no, we're not going to use that one, you may have to find an alternative that has been approved by your district and they do have an agreement. So again, I see that as being the exception and not the rule, but that may happen down the road with a tool or a resource that you commonly use. What can you do right now? Well, as I mentioned before, you may be asked by your district to create a list of all those different resources that you use. Even if you're not, it's not a bad idea to do that, because number one, you have that list available so that if your district does ask you and say, hey, could you let us know what you're using, especially if it comes later in the year, when you're getting ready to kind of to wrap up the school year and there's all those busy things going on, or maybe it happens right before summer and you want to kind of just move on and get right on with your summer break, you've got that list available. But it also allows you to share with your colleagues. If you're in a big district where there's a lot of different educators at the same grade level, or maybe different buildings, you can kind of compare and contrast what you're using and what everybody's using. Maybe that helps you to sort of solidify a plan for some common themes across the grade levels. We could even use it vertically as well, looking at what the grades ahead of you or below you are doing and what they're using, and maybe finding out that that there are other resources that you could use to sort of make that transition from each grade level a little bit easier. So it's not a bad idea to have that list of tools readily available for you. Become familiar with your district plans and policies for it. As I mentioned, districts are probably in all different ranges of where they are in developing their plans and their policies. So as you start to hear from your district about what's going on with the SOPA policies and procedures, just become familiar with them. Make sure you know the processes for if you do have to make the list, or if you are asked to, what you have to do if you find a new tool that you really like and you want to use, and how you have to submit that. Just make sure you understand what they're wanting you to do and what the procedures are. This is a situation where we often say, it's better to ask for forgiveness than ask for permission. This is definitely a situation where you don't want to be asking for forgiveness. So make sure you are up to date with what those plans are. If they haven't come out yet, keep an ear out. If they have, make sure you take a look at them and ask questions. Communicate with those administrators, with your building administrators, your district administrators. Your curriculum leaders may be a big part of this as well, as they review the different resources that are being used, as well as technology leaders. So just communicate with them, ask questions, make sure you know what's going on, because like I said, you don't want to be on the wrong side of this, where you are using something that hasn't been vetted, hasn't been approved after that July 1 date. Some additional resources as far as SOPA. We have an awesome intro video to SOPA on our website. You can click on that link there and it'll take you. It's 2 minutes or so. It's just a couple minutes of basically what we've talked about already, and it does it in a very nice and very pleasing manner. So you can use that and share that out with other people who may want to see it. There's a legislative brief from the LTC that we have listed on the website. That's where a lot of the information came from. And that's a really quick 2-page read that really breaks down in simple terms what SOPA means. There's a Q&A document that my colleague Chris, that I mentioned before, has been working on, and trying to keep those questions that are coming in about SOPA and trying to answer them to the best of our ability. As we get more clarification, we try to update those as best as possible. And then lastly, there's upcoming LTC events for SOPA. We've got webinars, we've got other resources and other events that are coming up. So if you are someone who is much more involved with the SOPA policies and procedures of your district, highly encourage you checking those things out so you can see what's coming up with the LTC, and not to mention other LTC events in general as well. So I kind of breezed through that a little bit, and I apologize for those technical difficulties, but we will take a moment here to check out some questions. And I thank you, Chris, for addressing some of those throughout. Chris, you may know the answer to this one better about when ISB guidance is coming.
Yeah, there's not a timetable at this point for when ISB will have more guidance, but we do expect them to have more guidance at some point. So,
yeah, that's what I was going to say, but I want to make sure that I know you've got your ear to it a little bit more, so I want to make sure that I didn't misspeak. So, and again, I wish we could go into more details about specific apps and resources and things like that, but we really can't do that yet because like I said, each district is going to handle this differently. So again, I can't stress enough to communicate with your building and district level administrators on policies and procedures to go by. So take one more pause here to see if there's any other questions. That's a great question there as far as the DPAs. Chris, are other districts doing something similar with those addendums?
yeah, that's a very specific question, but ultimately you can have whatever you want to as far as an agreement goes. So if you want to add an addendum to the Illinois DPA, you can do that as a school district. The issue that causes, or what the result of that is that every school district that would want to try to utilize the Illinois NDPA with that particular vendor then has to look at, like if you were the originating agreement, every district that was going to use your agreement would have to then vet your addendum to make sure it complies with them. Otherwise, they need to get another agreement. And I know that's a very complex answer for this particular webinar, but
yeah, if you're on, there are some sample agreements basically that districts can use that to make it easier on them to write the agreements, and so they can make they're just talking about making adjustments to those agreements in this scenario. So if you weren't sure what that was all about, it just has to do with a little bit more of the how the sausage is made when it comes to those agreements. So
yep.
All right, well, awesome. I don't see a whole lot of other questions coming in here. I know that we're getting some more specific questions related to those privacy agreements, and we can reach out to you to answer those questions because those go a little bit more farther in depth than just what a teacher might need to know. So we'll make sure we follow up with you on those things. Otherwise, please make sure you reach out to us, and we're here to help you navigate SOPPA and becoming ready for the next school year. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we will be in touch. Thank you.